All right, here we go for the first speaker, Dr. Richard Johnson. I love when they're already applauding before I get a chance. Is a professor of medicine known for his extensive research on sugar's impact on health and his work on the natural sugar alternative, Allulose. Please welcome Dr. Richard J. Johnson.
Hello. Thank you very much, citizen scientists, and it's so wonderful to be here. I want to thank David for inviting me, and I'm going to tell a story today about a tale of two sugars. Uh-oh. It's not moving. Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. So everyone knows that obesity and diabetes are epidemic. It really has increased dramatically in the last 100 years. And we have our classic associations of obesity with things like diabetes and high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. But also, there are newer associations of the metabolic syndrome with diseases like Alzheimer's, like cancer, like behavioral disorders. And so the question, is could these all be related, and how can we, combat this pool of diseases that are affecting us? And a lot of people have argued that obesity is simply from eating too much, and we are eating more than we were before, and because we're inactive, and we are more inactive than we were before. So a lot of people have suggested that it's bad habits, but we all know that it's not so easy to lose weight by exercising and reducing our food intake. And it doesn't work very effectively. A lot of us fail. So what can nature teach us? So one way to view this is to look at obesity as a condition that is used in nature as a survival tool. And most animals will maintain their weight very tightly during most of the year. And if they eat too much one day, they eat less the next. They keep their weight regulated. But there is a set of types of animals that will purposely become obese. For example, in preparation for hibernation or long-distance migration. And so if we can understand what triggers them to become obese, we might actually learn a little bit about obesity for us as well. So it turns out that when studies are done of these animals that will hibernate, it turns out that they are biologically activated to gain weight. And they, beginning like 8 weeks before they hibernate, a bear will suddenly become voraciously hungry. It will eat huge amounts of food, and will store fat. It can gain as much as 10 pounds a day, and it also becomes insulin resistant. It gets fatty liver. It gets elevated fats in its blood. It gets all the features that we call metabolic syndrome. And it turns out that it's biologically driven. So, and now we're learning more and more that obesity is really a biologically driven disease, not so much a cultural disease. And we eat more because we stay hungry, and we sit more because we have less energy. So the question is, what triggers it? And our group has done a lot of work on this, and we've identified fructose, which is the sugar present in fruit, when it's eaten in excess, can trigger this biologic switch. And our work has shown that when you feed an animal fructose, you stimulate hunger, you stimulate thirst, you stimulate food intake, you stimulate the process of foraging. The animals become resistant to leptin, they eat more, they become resistant to insulin, they become pre-diabetic. This actually helps maintain glucose delivery to the brain. They develop some inflammation, which probably is there to help protect them from infection. They raise their blood pressure, which is to maintain their circulation. And they actually shift away from using oxygen. They reduce their oxygen consumption because they suppress their mitochondria, which uses oxygen to produce energy. So that may make you think that sugar or fructose and fruits are bad, but actually fruits, an individual fruit has very little fructose relative to like a soft drink. And the major source of fructose today is from sugars, added sugars like high fructose corn syrup and table sugar. And natural fruits contain small amounts of fructose, but they also contain a lot of wonderful things. And I'm not telling you not to eat fruit. In fact, fruit is healthy. But if you eat a lot of fruit, you can overcome that, like fruit juice, for example. And so what we've suggested is that when what was meant to be a survival mechanism to forage and store fat for when there's no food around is now driving a lot of our diseases, and that all this marked rise in conditions like Alzheimer's and so forth might all be related to one particular pathway. So, of course, if it's fructose, we all thought, including me, that means, it's mainly sugar. That's the problem, sugar and high fructose corn syrup. But we've known now that actually the body can make fructose. And it makes fructose only one way. There's only one way it makes it. It makes it from carbohydrates. And when you eat sugary foods, they contain fructose. But when you eat starchy foods like rice, potatoes, cereal, chips, French fries, a lot of things that we like, that produces glucose. The glucose goes up in your blood after you eat. That rise, what we call postprandial glucose, actually triggers not just insulin, but also a conversion of glucose to fructose. And that pathway is accelerated by things like salt, alcohol, and stress. So how does the fructose work? This is actually the important slide. Everybody thought that the way you become fat is you eat too many calories, like shown on the left. That increases your energy, the ATP, which is the active energy in our body. And then when the active energy fills up, like you fill up a gas tank, the extra energy gets stored as fat. So that's what everyone thought. But the actual way it works is that when you eat fructose, it drops the ATP in the cells. So it drops your active energy, creating an alarm signal to eat. And while at the same time, it blocks the release of ATP from metabolizing the fat. So it creates a false impression that you're low energy, which triggers all these things to stimulate fat and so forth. And if you biopsy someone, the liver or the muscle of a person who's overweight, the ATP levels are low in the tissues, even though they have excess energy on board. So this is a famous study from 2008 where if you inject glucose like into an animal, in this case it's injected into the brain, glucose is a good guy and raises ATP, and it makes you, satisfies hunger, hunger goes down, food intake goes down. This is in a mouse, by the way. And if you give fructose, ATP levels fall, you get hungry, and it triggers food intake. So it's all about the energy in the cell. And I'm not going to go through this slide, but basically this pathway, we've actually figured out how it works. And it works on the mitochondria, which are these little things in the cells that make ATP. It suppresses the production of ATP, and that keeps the ATP levels low. And that triggers food intake. And the principal driver is a substance called uric acid, which is only produced from fructose of all the carbohydrates. And fructose generates this uric acid to do this. So you might look at this guy and you say, hey, is he a high energy individual? Is he like up and fired up with a lot of energy? No, he's fatigued and tired, and he has all these conditions. But if you actually measure the energy in him, his total energy is high, because although his ATP is low, the active energy, his stored energy is very high. So his total energy is high. And this is what fructose tries to do. It tries to increase your energy by increasing your fat and decreasing your active energy. So what can we do? Well, I'm going to, I've talked plenty of times on how this drives metabolic syndrome and diabetes and obesity. I'm going to just hit a couple neurologic diseases and show you how this happens. So let's look at Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is increasing significantly. It was extraordinarily rare before 1950. It's now like the 7th most common cause of death. In some places, it's increasing even more. It's due to this atrophy of the brain with these amyloid plaques. And it's been a huge mission for pharma to try to develop ways to block Alzheimer's. They made like 20 different drugs to block the plaques. And guess what? It works like crap. It doesn't work at all. Trying to inhibit the amyloid plaques was not really an effective way to prevent Alzheimer's. So people said, hey, we should look at what happens early in Alzheimer's before the brain really shrivels up. Can we actually intervene earlier? And so when they look early, they find 3 phenomena present in the brains of early Alzheimer's. There's insulin resistance, which we know is a fructose effect systemically. There's mitochondrial dysfunction and low ATP. That's also a fructose effect. There's inflammation. That's a fructose effect. Could it be fructose that's involved in Alzheimer's? Well, the risk factors for Alzheimer's are also the risk factors that are associated with metabolic syndrome. Eating high glycemic carbs, eating sugar, a high salt diet, other ultra-processed foods are all associated with this. And in fact, studies like the NHANES have shown that the more sugar you eat, the worse your memory is, both short-term memory and long-term memory. There's a direct link between sugar intake and memory. Not only that, there's a direct link between sugar and how big your brain is. When you eat a lot of sugar, your brain starts to shrink. That's been shown. Not only, and the main area that involves memory, recent memory, which is the most sensitive place that's hit, is called the hippocampus. And the more you drink sugar, soft drinks, it's associated with shrinkage of the hippocampus. That's not good. So there's a link between sugar intake and dementia. If you give fructose to laboratory rats, they have trouble getting through a maze. And it happens within several weeks, and it takes like a month or 2 to recover when you stop the sugar. Sometimes they don't recover at all, completely. And not only that, when you look at that hippocampus or other areas of the brain involved in memory and cognition, you can show that fructose induces insulin resistance in the brain, which we know is the earliest finding in Alzheimer's. It induces oxidative stress in the brain, an early feature of Alzheimer's. It reduces mitochondrial production of ATP. That's a fructose-specific effect. We see it with fructose intake, but that's what we see in early Alzheimer's. And in fact, if you keep giving fructose, guess what happens? After about 18 weeks, they develop amyloid plaques. They develop this tau protein. Basically, I can tell you that fructose is likely the cause of Alzheimer's. And we published this recently. And it's, anyway, so here's a very interesting thing. A paper just came out showing that you can block dementia in diabetic animals by blocking fructose metabolism. And so on the top row here, the DB, I should label that DB means diabetes. So a diabetic mouse has high fructose levels in the brain, has a high levels of the transporter for fructose, has a high level of the fructose enzyme that drives the low ATP, and has a low ATP. That is low ATP. They have cognition problems. Now, if you block that, if you inject an antisense to block that fructokinase in the brain, suddenly the animals improve dramatically, and they learn how to go through a water maze, which they couldn't do before. So the diabetic animal takes a long time to get through the maze, but the treated diabetic animal goes back to normal. So you can reverse early dementia by blocking fructose metabolism. And also you can do this trick where on the water maze, you put these little platforms where they have to get to, and if you move a platform, the animals are in trouble if they're diabetic and they're developing dementia. They can't find it. But if you reverse that fructose, you can reverse it. They can find the platform. So what about humans? Well, this is a study in humans. Alzheimer's patients have 6-fold higher fructose levels in their brain. They have low ATP. I can tell you that this is the cause of Alzheimer's. Not only that, how do they get it? Well, when you eat sugar, you do get fructose levels going up in the brain. But you know what's the major way to raise fructose in the brain? Carbs, high glycemic carbs, French fries, potatoes, because that makes the brain produce fructose. This is a study in humans from Yale. Within 45 minutes of putting a person, raising their blood glucose, they're making fructose in the brain. And that's a lot of fructose. It's actually the blue line, and that's the increase from 0. That's actually turns out to be a lot. Uric acid is how fructose works. This is a big, huge study. 375 metabolites, they call it a metabolomic study. Only one of them, out of 375 metabolites, there was one that was a dramatic increased risk for dementia. And you know what it was? Uric acid. Urate is another word for uric acid. It's not on the normal line. It's so high. And there's other studies that have shown this. And we know that uric acid in the brain blocks mitochondrial ATP and can trigger low energy levels in the brain. Here's another study. Again, this one looked at 52 studies, 45 risk factors. Only one linked with increased risk for dementia, elevated uric acid. And they did it through a Mendelian thing, so they looked at the genetics of it. So if you genetically have a high uric acid, it's not good. So what we think is that processed foods, junk foods, that they don't just drive obesity, they drive fructose production in the brain, generate uric acid, causes neuroinflammation, insulin resistance in the brain, knocks down ATP, causes Alzheimer's. It's reverse, and if you hit it early, you can probably reverse it. Keto diets, low glycemic diets are the way to go. You guys are all here for a good reason. You all believe in keto diets, I think, and they are really a great way to prevent Alzheimer's. So why would high glycemic carbs cause Alzheimer's? The reason is because high glycemic carbs trigger fructose production. Fructose triggers foraging. Foraging is where you go looking for food. It's a wonderful quality to be, because you have to be brave, adventurous, excitement-seeking. You have to go into areas where no one's been. You have to be like an adventurer. You have to be brave. You have to be able to assess the world quickly. You can't deliberate. It's actually a successful behavior. It allows you to find food more easily. But how do you do that? The way you do it is you have to turn on the visual cues so you can see the food. See that little red dot? That's when you give fructose to a human. The visual cues to pick out the cake and the food is immediate. It's immediate. You go, oh my God, where's the food? The blood flow, when you give glucose, the first few minutes, glucose takes 45 minutes to convert to fructose. So if you give a 15-minute test, you're actually looking at what glucose does and what fructose does. When you give glucose, blood supply goes up to the brain. ATP goes up for the first few minutes until it converts to fructose. But if you give fructose, blood flow goes down to the brain. It goes down in the areas of self-control. They don't want you to have self-control. They want you to be able to go into the lion's den. They don't want you to have vivid memory of how dangerous it is. So fructose lowers the blood flow to the hippocampus. This is how it works. It's supposed to be a good thing. It is good in some respects. If you raise uric acid in the animal, the same thing. You take a mouse, you raise its uric acid, it becomes exploratory. It gets hyperactive. It starts looking around for things. It actually initially goes farther distances. It forages, but when it's not foraging, it will rest like a rock to conserve its energy. And studies in humans also have linked high uric acid with excitement seeking and impulsivity. So that's why that happened. But you know what? This also tells us what's causing behavioral disorders. You probably know that ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and bipolar disease are increasing dramatically. They've increased in parallel with sugar intake. They linked with sugar intake, both bipolar disease and also with high glycemic carbs. Recently, it's been shown that ADHD is a type of foraging behavior. This one group just published a study showing that if you have ADHD and they test you for being able to find like berries in an online game system, you will find more berries than the normal person. You're going to be more successful at finding the food. You're going to be more successful at foraging and going to different places. So you won't stay at one place very long. When it starts being depleted, you are the first one to leave. This is what this study shows. Think about it. Having ADHD actually you're a champion because you actually can forage. This was a successful behavior. The trouble is, when you're doing it all the time, it starts to decrease the blood supply and drops the energy in the brain. And people like with bipolar disease, they tend to be insulin resistant. They eat high carbs. They have high uric acid levels. And look at this. They have very high fructose levels in their brain. This is human studies. It correlates directly with the hospitalization rate. Bipolar disease is due to intracerebral fructose production that lowers ATP, and it was meant to be a good thing, but when it's overactive, it's bad. So what are our solutions? Well, these keto diets are fantastic. This is a paper from Georgia Eades. Chris Palmer has done similar work. You put people on a low-carb diet, you can improve people. You can improve their behavior. You can reduce their risk for dementia. It isn't just obesity. Some people like to get Ozempic to lose weight. You get Ozempified. It's good. Look at the dramatic weight loss. It's expensive. A lot of side effects. And it recurs. There must be better solutions. So I have to confess that I got so into, I've been studying fructose for 25 years, and I was approached by people. Uric Sugar is a company that markets Allulose, which is a sugar that looks like fructose, but it's just one slight change. And I got interested in it because it does not activate the switch. It does not drop the energy. And so I joined the company, and I'm half-time a professor and half-time with the company. So that's my disclosure. But I did it because I believe that this is actually a great potential solution. So what the heck is allulose? It's a natural sugar. It's found in wheat and other things. It's low calorie. It's low glycemic. It's sweet. Everyone's eating some. We're just not eating enough. And what happens is when you eat allulose, it gets absorbed and then not metabolized and then excreted through the urine, and a little bit gets excreted through the gut. And it does not activate this bicarb switch, this fructose switch. It does not activate this survival switch. And it has some added benefits, and those added benefits includes that it reduces the glucose response. This is the only low-calorie sugar that actually reduces the rise in glucose after a meal. It actually stimulates this thing called GLP-1, which is what Ozempic does, but it's a natural stimulant, and it stimulates only for a couple hours after you eat. So you get this little boost that keeps the glucose levels down, so it will reduce the amount of fructose produced. It blocks fructose absorption as well because it competes with the fructose transporter. And it has a lot of other benefits. And so if you give it to animals, you can see that it stimulates GLP-1. This is the same thing that Ozempic does, or Ozempic is a GLP-1 agonist that is present, elevated all the time. And if you give it to humans, you get a really whopping GLP-1 response. It suppresses food intake because of that. So if you take allulose like a chocolate bar, you can actually reduce it stimulates some satiety, and it can block weight gain. This is in animals, this mice. They get less fat. You can improve their diabetes. It's really good, and it can reduce body weight. This is a human study. It doesn't have the big effect that Ozempic does, but we've had some people lose 50 pounds, but not everyone does that. It blocks, if you give it with sugar, it blocks the rise, like in table sugar. This is sucrose or table sugar. This is human studies. It really blocks that rise in glucose. And remember, that's what triggers the fructose production in the brain. And it affects, it's been shown to help diabetics. So if you have type 2 diabetes and you're taking it, it will help keep that sugar following a meal more tight within the range that you want it. This was a study that was done in Egypt, actually. It blocks leaky gut. My work shows that leaky gut is the cause of anaphylactic, food allergies to peanuts and so forth, because you have to get those peanut antigens across the gut into the blood. It's important for the origin of celiac disease, where you get the gluten across the gut. If you can block a leaky gut, you're going to block the development of celiac disease. And Crohn's disease is also linked with sugar intake and may involve similar pathways. It improves exercise endurance if you're a mouse. I don't know about a human, okay? But it does. If you're a mouse, it increases glycogen in the muscle, which leads to a little bit better performance. We need to do studies in humans, okay? But bottom line is, here's a study where it improved cognition. So the way, again, remember, the problem with cognition is if you make fructose in the brain and it's made by a particular cell called the microglia, and that cell has the fructose transporter, so if allulose can block that and lower uric, it also probably lowers uric acid, and these are benefits that can lead to improved outcomes and ability to think logically and so forth. And if you give, fructose or glucose, you get all these changes in blood flow to the brain. With allulose, you don't. So I've talked to you about the tale of two sugars, the bad and the good. Fructose is the bad. It blocks the mitochondria, and it lowers ATP, and that is the mechanism that seems to drive behavioral disorders. It's the mechanism driving dementia, and it's also driving all these other things, but it was meant to be good. Transiently dropping it makes you eat more. It helps you store fat so you can, survive winter, but we're not hibernating. We're just continuing to eat. So this is why it's bad. Chris Palmer I want to say that he is a fantastic guy. We're going to be collaborating with him to look at some of these effects on behavior and as well as on dementia. And allulose seems to be a good sugar. We need to know more about it. I'm just learning more about it, but it does look like a great fructose substitute. It's low calorie, it's sweet, it's metabolically healthy, it stimulates GLP-1, it lowers uric acid. At least we believe it does. We're going to do more studies on that. It may promote weight loss, etc. So thank you very much. I can take questions for a minute.
We have a little bit of time for questions if somebody wants to ask a question real quick. Go ahead.
Can you talk about the addictive properties of sugar and carbs from an addiction standpoint?
Yeah. So sugar is addicting to many, you can make an animal addicted to sugar. We've done it. And it's similar to alcohol. We can make an animal addicted to alcohol. Not all animals get addicted to alcohol. Not all animals get addicted to sugar, but most do. We've actually identified that this fructose enzyme is what drives addiction. It's not taste. We've been able to, you can make an addicted mouse that can't taste sugar, and it will be addicted to sugar. But if you block the fructose metabolism, keep the ATP levels normal, they don't get addiction. We think addiction is from the ATP, makes you feel like your energy's low and you got to eat more. And so we think that that's the mechanism. We've actually, published it. I have a grant from the NIH, $6 million grant, because when we block fructose metabolism, we block alcoholism. And so the Alcohol Institute at the NIH funded us to develop a fructose inhibitor to block alcoholism. Yes. Well, maybe. Yeah, one more question.
Some studies have suggested that in some people that artificial sweeteners trigger insulin response.
I have. And saccharin, which is the one that was published in Nature, that does induce insulin resistance through a gut microbiome pathway. Interestingly, we find very subtle evidence for the others. And they do not cause obesity. But a lot of the artificial sugars, they don't have benefits. They're more neutral, or they could be negative because, it is true if you keep eating sweets, that seems to, the taste buds does make you want to continue to eat sweets. But the addiction is actually not driven by taste. It's driven by the metabolism. No, I would love to. I think it should be done.
We're going to have to wrap it here. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Be blessed.